It was a very luxurious period, very luxurious. And the women's eyes looked as if they totally believed that forever and ever what they believed was going to be.
Well, the Belle Epoque was, there was never going to be another war, and everybody was having a good time.
There was an ice cream shop called Rumpelmeyer in Berkeley Square, where I, as a child, I made a pig of myself anyway, but I used to love eating their strawberry ices. They were the best ice creams that any human being would ever wish to see. They were, bar none. And now they're all gone.
My grandfather, he had a salt spoon, and on the salt spoon was about 4 or 5 drops of port, which he was giving this 2-month-old baby so he'd have a really good taste for fine wines. My mother almost had a fit.
But the society people, of course, didn't work. When my grandfather went bankrupt in 1901, my father had never been taught to work because no gentleman worked.
I miss the refinement of that period. I remember the dress of my mother. The inside of the dress was as beautiful to me as the outside.
There has rarely been a time like it.
Those who lived through those years would come to call it La Belle Époque, which roughly translated means beautiful era. Now, from 1890 to the beginning of World War I, 1914, the world belonged more or less to fashionable society with a capital S. The wealthy and privileged commuted freely between the great cities of Europe and America in search of beauty and pleasure. Looking back, the era at first seemed like an untroubled period when the privileged lived in a kind of, you might call it a fairy tale, supporting the arts and inspiring innovation. But the truth was much more disturbing than that. Their self-indulgence generated a fierce rebellion in politics and art. Great figures like Freud, Einstein, Picasso, Stravinsky were among those who would begin to shatter the conceits of the time, while the elite, wearing exquisite blindfolds, would dance their way into World War I.
And then, because of World War I suppose it was bound to happen, it's all stopped. But it was a great moment. Great! Great! Now, I was born in the heart of the Belle Époque. I was born in Paris. I was born in the Avenue Bois. I mean, everything was on my side to know about it, but I was young. But I just remember the most wonderful excitement all the time, and the most beautiful people. I suppose all children think of all people who are grown up as being the most privileged and the most delightful people in the world. I'm sure that's only normal. But I thought it was very special at that time.
It was a special time, but only for a relatively small group of people who viewed the world as though it was roughly divided into 2 classes, the elite and everyone else. For the French elite, La Belle Époque is now remembered as the time when the pursuit of beauty, entertainment, and romance constituted a way of life. A time when the President of France died in his mistress's arms, and his death inspired songwriters, not mourning. And when the women of Paris were encouraged to dedicate themselves to personal beauty.
They always kept their parasols very straight. They were rather high, and then they came down and they didn't get any sun, and that was a very good thing for their skins.
Beautiful women were the aristocrats of the day, inspiring painters, writers, and early photographers. And their clothing was considered a form of the fine arts. Paris was the fashion capital of the world, and Charles Worth was its king.
His clothes are magnificent. One of his famous dresses is the dress of the Comtesse de Greffule, a black velvet with the white satin lilies up the back. Now, the Comtesse de Greffule was a very beautiful Parisian woman. It was a great inspiration to Proust, and she became the heroine of Swann's Way.
Proust would use society as the raw material for his work, and in turn be seduced by the life itself. He recorded every detail, the love affairs, the scandals. The old elite had grown bored with traditional social constraints. Now, more and more, the establishment was drawn by the exciting and eccentric world of the artist.
Sarah Bernhardt was in many ways a typical survivor of La Belle Époque. The most popular name for her was the Divine Sarah, and she capitalized on that. She was well aware of it. She was quite a conscientious eccentric. She would do a lot of things just for publicity, I think. Now, perhaps she meant it, but she was famously known for having a coffin as her bed, and she was photographed sleeping in her coffin for a time. I don't think she did it very often.
By the 1890s, Paris had become synonymous with indulgence. It was now the upper-class playground of the world.
But you know, a place like the Moulin Rouge, it's so exciting. I mean, everyone comes on in such a mood, and they were dance halls. They were a form of theater, of entertainment. Nothing as famous in the world as the Moulin Rouge, the Bal Tabarin, and the Folies Bergère.
But Toulouse-Lautrec revealed that beneath the exuberance of this scene lay a deep bitterness. Auguste Renoir. Renoir, who had once been ridiculed for his experiments with light and form, had long championed the artist's right to a personal vision. Now, among those following him, there was an increasing sense of independence. Claude Monet, Georges Seurat, Vincent van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, Paul Cézanne. As their freedom of expression took them in many directions, they left the taste and sensibility of their traditional patrons behind.
It was a world in itself. They were all great friends, I think.
In Great Britain, the 1890s were far more sedate, well, on the surface at least. The world of the aristocracy was a world of its own, and only officially influenced by an aging Queen Victoria. And the true art of that moment was the glorification of power. Wealth and assurance was provided by the empire.
Oh, the British Empire, I can tell you about that. At that time of my life, we were very powerful indeed. We used to be described as the empire in which the sun never set. Reason, we had India and Canada and Australia, Lord knows what we didn't have, you see. And there was very little that we didn't have.
We ruled over a quarter of the globe, and we also had under us a quarter of the world's population. It was also that we pushed our way into everything. So we were everywhere. The English were everywhere. They were at the top of the pops, as we now say now, and everybody thought they were tremendously powerful. I don't think they liked us very much, but they respected us. So we interfered with everything, and everywhere you looked, there was the British. 24 descendants of Queen Victoria, 24 of her relations, were on the thrones of Europe. It's unbelievable. She was a marvellous matchmaker. She sat in Windsor like an old spider, really determined that all her descendants should have an important place.
Mind you, we were very frightened of Germany because the Kaiser was, Kaiser Bill, I'm talking about, pre-World War I, was a very bellicose man. He used to wear his, I can see him now, his moustache like that. I thought it was waxed or God knows what. I always wondered how the devil he had it. I'd stayed right up top like that, always.
Kaiser Wilhelm was Queen Victoria's grandson. A jealous man and very troublesome, of course. But that story comes later. In the 1890s, Queen Victoria's government seemed to have its world well under control. Society and artists played by her rules, well, at least in public. But there were closet rebellions that would surface from time to time, revealing quite another sensibility. In one glorious, provocative collaboration, the divine Sarah Bernhardt and playwright Oscar Wilde rehearsed an outrageous presentation of the Salome story. Later illustrated by Aubrey Beardsley, the biblical tale of Herod and John the Baptist, mixed with open sensuality, provoked a self-righteous storm in Victorian Britain. The London Times called it not only bizarre, but offensive and very repulsive. And Salome was banned.
And there was a great deal of, I suppose, what we call decadence. But of course, I didn't see any of that. I only saw the horses.
In each country, La Belle Époque took on a very different style. In America, the focus was not on high culture or the acquisition of political power. Here, the new aristocracy was dedicated to making money.
In the people that sort of lived in the Newport area, everybody seemed to be pretty darn well off. People could have yachts. They went up and down to New York over the weekends. They were all out to just do the thing up brown. We had the Vanderbilt family with railroads and shipping. The Astor family, they had to do with real estate and fur coats. You had the Berwin family that were all to do with mining. I don't know where Senator Wetmore got his money from, but he got enough to put up a pretty big house. One gentleman said, to show that he was just going along with things, he said, I don't care, he said, as long as it costs us $1 million more than my brothers. This is just one of the summer cottages that right next door to the Breakers, not quite as presumptuous as the Breakers, but you see that little white figure there? That's me. Naturally, I thought that was going to be home forever. I was a simple-minded little boy. I thought this seemed pretty good. Tennis Week was a big bang in those days. All the activities of the Northeast United States in the summertime, all the thinking all took place at the Newport Casino. If we went down there for that, you were dressed up right up to the nines. Neck pieces, earrings, hats, umbrellas, the whole doggone works.
Americans went to Europe and brought back the trappings of the beautiful life. Imported the great houses, the art, the manners. What they lacked was a true aristocracy, so one family after another moved to sell their daughters to titled Europeans. Consuelo Vanderbilt, for instance, was married off to the highest title available at that time, the Duke of Marlborough.
I just adored the Duchess of Marlborough. I think she's the most beautiful human thing that's ever walked. I just can never stop looking at her. with her throat and her legs and her strength and her straight back and her tiny head and beautiful eyes. And she retained forever that look.
Some people say that she didn't want to marry him. Some people say that her mother wanted him to marry him. And I just don't know exactly who wanted to marry whom. It was a great wedding. My mother says, as far as weddings go, that it was a bang. All the girls were all dressed up, 500 gardenias and orchids and everything else like that, and they had themselves quite a time. It's a moot point as to whether she was really as happy as she could have been with the Duke, but those kind of things go on.
Well, I can only tell you this, that there were some very charming ladies who married English peers. I did myself. I married Catherine, she was called Catherine Wendell, actually. Perfect darling. She's buried here, and I adored her. She was the sweetest thing in the world. As to whether or not I knew Consuelo Vanderbilt, who married my great friend Bert Marlborough, answer, I knew them both, but I can only tell you this, that she, if you please, amused herself by keeping, I should think, rough guess, I can't remember, I was very young at the time, I would suggest she had about 150 of these King Charles Spaniels, which made the most horrible messes all over Blenheim Palace, weren't at all popular with anybody, least of all me, and these damn things, I can see them now. And then one slipped on the messes they made, and altogether they were repulsive. Anyway, for a long while, but they got divorced, as you well know, and then out she went with her money and also with these wretched dogs.
La Belle Époque was less romantic than memory may suggest. That the dark side of life existed was not widely acknowledged. Manners were far more important than emotion. Hypocrisy was encouraged. So was turning away from disquieting realities. Oscar Wilde violated the rules of the game. His homosexual preferences had been privately accepted, but when he went public, the establishment proceeded to tear him apart.
Oscar Wilde, of course, was, evidently by his own admissions, everything else, brilliant man, but a top pederast. He was a queer. We all know that. I mean, it was. I believe if I never knew him myself, but if half what one heard about him was true, he must have been at the top of the league, I would think. And didn't he have? I think he had a great affair. Wasn't it not with Lord Alfred Douglas? Somebody was. It apparently did. Yes, I believe so. What did the British people feel about Oscar Wilde? I should say horrified.
Oscar Wilde was singled out for acts of gross indecency. After 2 years in prison, he died, a broken man. Just before his death, he wrote, "I would sooner have 50 unnatural vices than one unnatural virtue. It is unnatural virtue that makes the world, for those who suffer, such a premature hell." By the end of the century, the sense that the old values were law, that power was preordained, that empires would last forever, was shaken. In Austria, Emperor Franz Joseph was growing old, his power waning, when a tragedy struck the imperial court that seemed to signal the end of La Belle Époque, the assassination of the Empress Elizabeth, one of the most beautiful women in Europe.
I've forgotten where she was staying. But she came up to have lunch, I believe, with one of the Rothschilds. And walking back with her lady-in-waiting, she took the lady-in-waiting's arm and said, "Hold me." This is, to me, inexplainable. Why someone didn't see that this man was coming towards her. No one seems to have realized anything. And the first thing they realized that she was very, very faint. In the Austrian show, you know, I had the exact blouse that she wore with this tiny little, I mean, the length of a razor blade, of a man's razor blade. In this immaculate shirt, there was no blood of any kind because she was so tightly laced within that there was no blood on the outside at all. I believe in those days they were called anarchists.
As the 19th century ended, the attack on privilege and power took many forms. Anarchists assassinated 5 heads of state. But the true revolution was generated not by assassins, but by intellectuals and artists. In Vienna, Sigmund Freud, painter Gustav Klimt, composers Mahler and Schoenberg had already embarked on the interior journey that would reveal the face of modern man. And the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche had called for a re-evaluation of values. He predicted that all the power structures of the old society would be blown into the air. The old century had ended in scandal, in tragedy and violence. But the 20th century began with a burst of optimism. New inventions seemed to hold almost magical promise. And the century was welcomed with one of the most extravagant celebrations the world had ever seen. Paris, 1900. It was agreed that Paris should have the honor or pleasure or expense of launching what was to be known as the Universal Exposition.
And the emperors and the Shahs and the Raja and the Maharajas and the Americans and everybody came to Paris. The archdukes, the grand dukes from all over the world came to this beautiful city.
Imagine, in 1900, over 50 million people attended the fair. The entire city was rebuilt for the occasion. Oriental, African, and Middle Eastern pavilions suddenly appeared along the Seine. Among the visitors was a young boy from Russia, destined to become the great designer Erte.
My mother was traveling every year. She took my sister and myself in 1900 to the Paris World's Fair. And that was really a fairy tale for a boy of 7 years old. So then I decided I have to live there.
The fair was a celebration of the new technology mixed with exotic artifacts from the past. The wonders of electricity and wireless communications were introduced along with the most modern weapons. That modern machines and modern thought would prove fatal to La Belle Époque was still not understood. The ultimate embrace between art and technology was achieved by dancer Loie Fuller. Fuller used magic lantern projectors and optical devices to enhance her performance. She was described as an artistic intoxication and an industrial achievement. She was also considered an incarnation of Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau took its forms from nature. It brought a new kind of decoration and elegance to everyday life, even the Paris subway stations. Art Nouveau illustrations appeared on some of the first posters, celebrating a world that was optimistic and still naive. It was a search for simplicity in an increasingly complex world. With the same sense of optimism and naivete, the legendary photographer Jacques-Henri Lartigue, as a very young boy, began experimenting with another new art form.
My first photo, it is in 1902. I was 7 years. It is my family, the first day. I take photo of all I like, all amusing me, all I think marvelous. Many things. New aeroplane, or new car, and all things.
Lartigue once said of his work, "I don't photograph anything I don't like. I do the flowers. I don't do the weeds." The love affair with moving pictures also began just after the turn of the century. There were full-length features, and there were shorts. And an artist, Émile Cohl, began experimenting with the magic of animation. Film would not be limited to art and amusement. It would also be used to document the events of the time. 1901, Queen Victoria's funeral. The new King Edward would never be the monarch his mother had been, but he was an exuberant king who would lead British society in pursuit of the good life.
The whole of the society was based on gaiety. They had their private trains, which took them down to these enormous house parties they had at the weekend. The meals were colossal, because Edward was a great eater. They had everything that you can think of to amuse. And the women changed their dresses 3 or 4 times every day. I mean, we'd all go mad if we had to do that. They had nothing else to do. And of course, because Edward was having great affairs with lovely ladies in London, usually at tea time, so you received the heir to the throne in your drawing room. And that was the one afternoon you were not at home to anybody else. He loved women, and he was always having wild love affairs, despite the fact he had the most beautiful wife in Princess Alexandra. And she loved him till his death. She adored him. But she became deaf, and she couldn't hear all that was going on, which perhaps was a good thing.
The temptresses of Europe in the early days of the century were mostly entertainers from the worlds of theater and dance. In Paris, they were the demi-mondaines, and in London, they were the Gaiety girls.
She was trained to test a cigar for a gentleman. She knew how to select a chef. She knew everything about horses, about service. She took very good care of the people who took very good care of her.
Only the demi-mondaines were free to dye their hair and wear bright, extravagant clothes. They not only became the leaders in fashion, but for the Belle Epoque gentlemen, they were the ultimate status symbol.
They stood for something that was unique, that was glamorous, and my father said the great joy of a young man at the beginning of this century was that he could take out a Gaiety girl. You were really something very important, and you met her in your white tie and tails with a white carnation in your buttonhole, and you had your own private hansom if you were very dashing, and you took her out to Romano's for supper. And that was the sort of zenith that any young man could attain to.
I really don't know what I'm doing here at my age. It's ridiculous, really. Years ago, I was at a cocktail party that Alec Guinness gave when he was knighted, and Sir Alan Herbert, a very famous playwright, said, "Hello, I thought we were both dead." And anyway, it's much too near the camera for me, you know, close-ups. I mean, I can't take it. Well, there was a famous photographer years ago, Elwyn Neame. He used to photograph his people through gauze because it made them look much younger. I think you'd better photograph me through felt. They're much better. But now we go back here, don't we? The first leading lady was Mary Stoutholme, and she was the first postcard beauty. She was the first one who smiled with teeth, because before, in the old days, you see, in the Victorian days, there were no snapshots. You had to be taken like that, to keep still for about 12 minutes. I, as a little boy, was photographed with an iron thing at the back of my neck to keep still. But she was the first postcard beauty, and hundreds were sold of her. And here's the first one I ever bought, and my sister painted it for me. And here it is. Now, there. If you can see it. They're all Mary Stoutholme, you see, looking very glamorous. All the girls in those shows, they were showgirls. They had to be about 6 foot high. They only just did that or that. They never danced like now the dancers have to learn tap and ballet and everything else. They just walked occasionally about the stage. But they brought the young men in, and that's why they all married into the peerage. They wore those little gold watches here, and they throw all their sable furs into the footlights, and then one of them would say, "Oh, my dear, oh, look, it's 10 minutes to 1. We shall miss the first race at Ascot." And they'd just pick up all their bits and pieces and go. Didn't make any difference what the stage manager said. He couldn't do anything about. They were so very important.
Oh, I don't know what you see in me, but I see plenty in you. For when I hold you in my arms, the gray skies...
A woman's importance was meticulously judged by her effect on men. When American illustrator Charles Dana Gibson produced these drawings, satirizing the relationships of the day, the drawings became pin-ups, and the satire was rejected. And women continued to be defined principally by their relationships to their lovers, their husbands, their sons.
Completely all right when you're near. You make me glad when I'm feeling sad. You make me laugh when I'm blue. Oh, I don't know what you see in me, but I see plenty in you, my darling. Yes, I see plenty in you. Well, she was just what a boy would like to have his mother look like and be like. In the days of the wasp waist, she was right into the wasp waist. She had a lovely little singing voice and played the piano with a nice, easy, simple touch, not the way I play the piano. And I always remember that I was my pride, and right up until the day she died, she always looked just exactly just 100%.
Upper-class women, like upper-class children, were idolized as ornaments. Freud might be working in Vienna, but his thinking had not yet penetrated the nursery.
My mother said that I never should play with the gypsies in the wood. If I did, she would say, naughty girl to disobey. My mother said that I never should play with the gypsies in the wood.
If you were brought up in a ladies and gentlemen's family and you had any money, you were, of course, always with a nanny, and you were brought down to the drawing room in your best dress between 5 and 6, when you were told to keep quiet, and you had, if you were lucky, you had some bricks or something you were allowed to play with. But nobody talked to you. You just sat doing that. That was the great time when you saw your parents. Otherwise, you were kept entirely in the nursery and later in the schoolroom with your governesses. I wasn't allowed to go to a race meeting. I wasn't allowed to do anything because all that was, when you're grown up, you'll go to that. When you're out, when you've made your debut, when you've been presented at court, then you can do all those lovely things.
Every time the parents would come up to the nursery, my father would immediately say to the governess or whoever it was in charge of us, "I can't bear to see those beastly birds," he said, "spreading their blasted seeds all over the floor, only attract rats and mice and vermin. Get rid of them at once." So the nurse, or whoever it was, said, "Lord Carnarvon, the children love their birds. I don't give a damn about that. I give the orders. This is my house. Finney, get up, get rid of it." Now, you can imagine why we weren't all that pleased to see the parents.
Your hair shan't curl, your shoes shan't shine. You naughty girl, you shan't be mine. My father said that if I did, he'd bang my head with a teapot lid.
The general theme was that little people, children and young people, should be seen and not heard, and I think that applied everywhere. I well remember at one time hiding on the golf course behind a bush with a paper knife, and I had made up my mind that my father was so horrible to me that I would stab him. I hadn't the guts to do it or anything of the sort, and eventually I faded away. He never knew I'd even been there. We did in those days have our own private golf course.
Emotional conflict, like poverty, was kept outside the gates of the mannered life. But there came a time when these realities could no longer be held at bay, and the beautiful era and the beautiful people would never be the same. Artists knew what society would not admit, that traditional roles in human relations were too confining. A young widow named Emmeline Pankhurst came to see how over-refinement led directly to injustice.
She went one day to visit the girls' orphanage. It was a very cold November day. And the children looked very cold as they played out in the yard. And she said to the matron, "Matron, are the children properly clad for this kind of weather?" And the matron said, "Well, Mum," she said, "well, what about their underclothing? What about the knickers?" And the matron caught hold of her and said, "Oh, Mum, I'm so glad there's a woman here now." No, they haven't got proper knickers for the winter. But Mrs. Pankhurst said, "But why didn't you ask the guardians?" "Oh, I couldn't mention girls' knickers to the gentlemen," she said, "but now there's a lady here, I can." And Mrs. Pankhurst came home and thought, what kind of world are we living in, where you can't mention girls' underclothing because to men. And she said something must be done about this. And she decided that women really must have the vote.
Oh, yes, I do remember women talking political things all the time, at lunch and things like that. My mother bored me to death. Thought I'd go crazy. Keep them off the streets, I'd keep thinking. I remember Mrs. Pankhurst in London, in her bloomers and marching, and too ugly for words. I was for the ballet book.
And so was most of the male establishment of Great Britain. It was at the great social event, the Derby, that a suffragette named Emily Davison made a heroic gesture to call attention to the women's movement.
Emily Davison was a university graduate, a very clever woman. She was very upset because at that time the women's movement had been going along, but they'd got no real publicity. And Emily Davison thought the only way to get national attention was by doing something like this at no cost except to herself. She ran out the Derby, caught hold of the King's horse, and died subsequently. London came to a standstill at her funeral.
Looking back at the turn of the century, an Austrian writer, Robert Musil, would say, "From beneath a calm as smooth as oil, there suddenly surfaced currents of impelling force that swept all over Europe. No one really knew what would happen next." In the years just before the Great War, there was a sense of euphoria, a fantasy of the secure life. For the rich, living seemed to be his own reward. Oh, the socialists could sound off and the suffragettes march, but the privileged classes seemed quite serene sliding into the modern world. At the great restaurants like Maxime's, society women who had seldom been seen out publicly in the evening now suddenly appeared nearly everywhere. The world was changing very fast. A floating palace was commissioned, longer than the tallest building in the world, with swimming pools and Turkish baths and miniature golf on the upper deck. The Titanic was the ultimate in technology, the biggest and safest ship at sea. When it went down on its maiden voyage, it became the worst maritime disaster in history.
I was 11 when the Titanic went down. We've all been told it couldn't sink, of course. Because it was an English ship, it was a shock against the Empire, you see. It was another thing, the Empire was gradually beginning to crumble.
Some said it was a warning, an omen, about the worship of technology. But society was in love with travel, with new ways of living, with shaking off the restrictions of the past and the threats of the future. Omens were ignored. Life now included motor cars, and telephones, and liberated women. Women had not only thrown off social constraints, but physical ones as well. The change in women's clothing was a true revolution. Clothes were soft and easy now. The corset had been banished. One disapproving observer said, "Under those soft gowns, we could sense their bodies." Designer Paul Poiret countered with, "I am merely the first to reveal women's secret desires and fulfill them in advance." The forces of the unconscious began to surface in all forms of art. In the world of dance, Nijinsky and the Ballet Russe, led by Diaghilev, the great impresario, would transform European ballet.
I saw Nijinsky already in Russia, and I was just at the performance when he was fired by the Empress Mother because he had forgotten to put his tongues on. And her box was very near to the stage, so she could see all the details, and she was terribly shocked.
He didn't leap up, he leaped across the stage to the far end. We knew it was amazing because it was so amazing that it appeared amazing. And not all things that are amazing appear, perhaps, you know?
Nijinsky's performance of The Afternoon of a Faun in 1912 was so explicit that it went beyond where society was prepared to go. The final scene, dealing with sexual frustration, found an abandoned Nijinsky making love to a silken scarf. Artists were now exploring the interior emotional world that had so long been considered out of bounds. Eric Berg, nephew of composer Alban Berg,
is a fact that most of the artists, may it be sculptors, painters, musicians, they did not worry about the taste of their patrons and left behind them the pure idea of entertainment.
Gustav Klimt began his career as a court painter in Vienna before the turn of the century. In his early work, he stayed within the bounds of the manners of the time, depicting women as cool and detached, devoid of emotion. Later, his painting, while still very romantic, would become openly sensual.
I think that the change in Klimt's way of painting comes from the influence of Sigmund Freud.
Freud said that the path from fantasy back to reality is art. But there were those who would find reality, particularly sexual reality, unbearable. Art was now moving way beyond the sensibilities of its patrons. And artist Egon Schiele was jailed for pornography.
In my opinion, people painted by Schiele are not at all ugly. They have an inside life, you know. They are very spiritual.
Freud would say that he would be one of those who had disturbed the sleep of the world.
That's the most important thing about Vienna, not the great palaces, but Mr. Freud. He left his mark because he changed the world. He left a very long shadow.
You know, it is a fact that dying empires sometimes has a last burst of culture, a last burst of energy. That was the same thing in Austria.
In the year before the Great War, the cultural explosion struck all of Europe. The premiere of a new ballet in Paris was almost as violent as the guns of war, but it all began as a social event.
Oh, it was brilliant. All the ladies and the best jewels, they had plenty of tiaras, and all the men in tails. And wonderful dresses. It was a wonderful image.
Herté and the elite of Paris all assembled at the Champs-Élysées Theatre for a new ballet by Nijinsky, with a score by composer Igor Stravinsky, The Rite of Spring.
Well, I liked it very much, but the public was not prepared to hear it. It was too revolutionary. It was so different of what has been done before.
The Rite of Spring was a metaphor that evoked the terror of modern man faced with the unknown.
It was a shock for the audience with his disharmonies, with his dissonances, and with these very barbaric sounds of the orchestra. That was a real riot there.
Well, they were breaking chairs, they were screaming, they were whistling.
It was a scandal in Paris, tumultuous disaster.
Looking back now, it seems Stravinsky was prophetic. Artists had revealed the face of an unstable future. While their patrons tried to cling to a time already past.
There was a certain anxiety and uncertainness in the atmosphere of all artists that something could happen. And it feared that a catastrophe was near, that the war was coming.
It was 1913, the same year that The Rite of Spring was performed in Paris, that H.G. Wells published an enormously popular satire called Little Wars. And in this little book, Wells wrote, "Great war is at present, I am convinced, not only the most expensive game in the universe, but it is a game out of all proportion." He suggested, only half jokingly, the idea of replacing the real horror with war games played with lead soldiers, miniature fortresses, and scorecards. But the forces of change and reaction had proceeded far beyond the ability of anyone, game players or heads of state, to control. The Great War began almost by accident with the assassination of Francis Ferdinand, Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It would prove to be the end of La Belle Époque. Heads of state from all over the world would attend the funeral, and within weeks be at war with each other. '19th century pride would lead to the first 20th century war. The young fighting men of the day would make heroic attempts to hold on to the romantic code of the past.
In the first war, I am very friend with the aviator. I fly with the friend, with many aviators very known, Navarre, and I know very good, very well Guilmer, and many. And someday, when we have time, we come here to Maxime to dinner. And it was very, very amusing and marvelous. Il y avait toujours Le déjeuner était prêt pour les aviateurs.
Many aviators would go off to war in the morning, planning to return to a formal dinner that evening.
Et alors, après, il y en a qui s'envolaient le matin, d'autres qui partaient, tout ça. Et il y en avait presque toujours un qui était mort.
Almost every day someone was lost.
Et toujours son couvert était mis, on mettait une petite...
His place would be set at the table.
Pas tous les autres d'être aussi gais, aussi...
A rose would be placed there.
And everybody who was decent, of course, joined up at once. It was the most ghastly slaughter that ever happened, all those millions and millions of young men killed. But nobody even then realized what it was going to mean.
All the major powers on the continent had mobilized. And having mobilized, there was no way to stop the momentum. It wasn't long before it was clear that technology had revolutionized war. By the time it was over, several empires had fallen. Almost 15 million were dead. The secure world was gone forever.
People believed completely in their lives. Just think of the Russians with the troikas, with the marvelous horses across the snow, and the Grand Dukes and Duchesses covered in. People don't even dream anymore of such things that they could be.
I was about 8 or 9 years of age, and I was invited by King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, two charming people, and they gave a children's afternoon garden party at Buckingham Palace.
Calling was a thing which is absolutely forgotten now. See, when you had nothing else to do, you took your carriage, your two horses, or one if you were poor, and you drove round leaving cards on people. Then they left cards on you. And in the country, you drove for miles to leave your cards.
Nothing comes to an end. Everything is based on an evolution. It changes little by little, sometimes suddenly, but there's always the same basis.
What's it? Pack up the troubles in your old bag. A lot of English boys died to that song. Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile. Smile, smile. While you've a Lucifer to light your fag. Smile, boys, that's the style. What's the use of worrying? It never was worthwhile. So, pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile.